The phone rang at 2:17 a.m., and the name on the screen was someone he had buried emotionally 30 years ago. Arthur didn't reach for it immediately. He lay still in the center of his mattress, staring at the ceiling fan that hadn't spun in a decade. The vibration of the phone against the nightstand created a low, angry buzz that rattled the glass of water sitting next to his blood pressure medication. Robert. The screen lit up the room with a harsh, artificial blue light, casting long shadows against the peeling wallpaper. Arthur closed his eyes, counting the seconds. 4, 5, 6. He knew exactly how long the voicemail cycle took. He wasn't a man who panicked. Panic was a waste of energy, and at 64, Arthur had no energy to spare. The buzzing stopped. The room went black again. The silence that rushed back into the house was heavier than the noise. It was the silence of a house where no one had spoken a complete sentence in 5 years. Arthur sat up, his joints popping audibly in the quiet. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his calloused feet finding the cold hardwood floor. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the grit of a 2-day beard. He reached out and silenced the phone completely, placing it face down. He didn't check the voicemail. He stood up and walked out of the bedroom, navigating the dark hallway by memory alone. He knew exactly where the floorboard creaked outside the bathroom and stepped over it out of habit, even though there was no one left to wake up. This is a story about the heavy price of stubbornness and the decisions that wait for us in the dark. Before we follow Arthur into this difficult night, please subscribe to the channel and like this video if you understand the weight of unfinished business. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Arthur moved into the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed, a comforting mechanical sound. He opened it, the light revealing a sparse interior, a carton of milk, a block of cheddar cheese, 2 beers, and a jar of pickles. He took out the pitcher of cold water and poured a glass, drinking it standing up by the sink. He looked out the window above the sink. The driveway was empty except for his 2003 Dodge Ram 1500. The truck had rust eating away at the wheel wells, but the engine ran smooth because Arthur changed the oil every 3,000 miles, religiously. He took better care of that truck than he did of his own health. The phone in the bedroom started buzzing again. Arthur gripped the edge of the Formica counter. His knuckles turned white. Robert wouldn't call twice. Robert barely called once a decade. The last time they spoke, Clinton was in the White House, and their mother was still alive, crying at the kitchen table while Arthur packed a duffel bag. He set the glass down in the sink. It made a sharp clink. He walked back to the bedroom, his stride heavier this time. He picked up the phone. The screen was dark now, but a notification pulsed. Missed call 2. And then a voicemail icon appeared. Arthur sat on the edge of the bed. He pressed the speaker button. The voice that filled the room wasn't Robert's. It was a woman's voice, professional, tired, with the background noise of beeping monitors and squeaking shoes. "Mr. Arthur Vance, this is Nurse Miller calling from St. Mary's Hospital in Columbus. I'm calling regarding your brother, Robert Vance. We found your number in his wallet on a folded piece of paper listed as emergency contact. There isn't anyone else listed, sir. Please call us back as soon as you get this. It's urgent." Arthur stared at the device. A folded piece of paper. Robert didn't own a cell phone, or maybe he didn't have Arthur saved in it. He carried the number on paper. Arthur stood up and paced the small room. Columbus was 3 hours away, a 3-hour drive on the interstate in the middle of the night. He looked at his work clothes, draped over the chair, his uniform for the hardware store where he mixed paint and cut keys for people who had homes to maintain. He had a shift at 8 a.m. He could delete the voicemail. He could go back to sleep. He could claim he never heard it. They hadn't been brothers in anything but blood for 30 years. Robert was the one who left. Robert was the one who chose the bottle over the business their father built. Robert was the chaos. Arthur was the one who stayed and swept up the glass. But the phrase stuck in his mind like a splinter, folded piece of paper. Arthur dialed the number back. It rang once. "St. Mary's, ICU nursing station." "This is Arthur Vance," he said. His voice was gravel, unused to speaking this late. "I got a call about Robert." There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling on the other end. "Mr. Vance, thank you for calling back. Can you verify your date of birth?" "June 12th, 1961. "Okay. Mr. Vance, your brother was admitted 3 hours ago. Massive stroke. He's currently on a ventilator, but the prognosis is... it's not good. The doctor needs a family member here to make decisions regarding care. He's unconscious." Arthur looked at his own hand resting on his knee. It was steady. Why wasn't he shaking? "He has a son," Arthur said. "Call his son Michael." "We don't have any record of a son, sir, just you. The police brought him in. He was found in a motel room. All he had was his wallet and that piece of paper." Arthur closed his eyes. The motel room. Of course. "Is he going to wake up?" Arthur asked. "The doctor doesn't think so, but we need someone here to authorize next steps. Or to be here if he passes." Arthur hung up. He didn't say goodbye. He just pressed the red button. He sat there for a full minute. The house was dead quiet. He could hear the wind picking up outside, rattling the loose gutter on the east side of the house. He had been meaning to fix that gutter for 6 months. He stood up and walked to the closet. He pulled out his heavy canvas jacket and his boots. He sat on the floor to lace them up, pulling the strings tight until they dug into his ankles. He grabbed his keys from the dresser. He wasn't going because he forgave him. He was going because Vance men cleaned up their own messes. And right now, Robert was a mess that needed cleaning. Arthur walked out the front door, locking it behind him. The night air was biting, smelling of damp earth and impending rain. He climbed into the Dodge Ram. The engine turned over with a roar, breaking the neighborhood silence. He threw it into reverse, not looking back at the empty house. He had 3 hours to think about what he would say to a man who couldn't hear him. The interstate was a ribbon of wet asphalt stretching endlessly into the dark. Arthur kept the truck at a steady 65 miles per hour, refusing to move into the left lane even when the semi-trucks blasted past him, spraying dirty mist onto his windshield. The wipers slapped back and forth, thwack hiss, a hypnotic rhythm that dug up memories he had successfully ignored for decades. He didn't turn on the radio. He needed the noise of the road to drown out the conversation playing in his head. The last conversation. 1994. The kitchen of the house he was driving away from now. Robert, smelling of cheap bourbon and desperation, demanding his half of the hardware store's equity. Arthur, standing by the sink, washing grease off his hands with Gojo, telling him there was no equity, only debt and inventory. Robert had thrown a chair. It put a dent in the drywall that Arthur had patched, but never painted over perfectly. 30 years. Arthur took a sip from a travel mug of stale coffee he'd grabbed at a gas station near the on-ramp. It tasted like burnt beans and styrofoam. He grimaced and set it back in the holder. He reached Columbus just as the sky was turning a bruised purple in the east. The city skyline was a cluster of lights that looked cold and indifferent. He navigated the confusing hospital loop, following signs for emergency parking. He took a ticket from the machine, the gate arm lifting with a mechanical whine. He parked the Ram between a pristine BMW and a Lexus SUV. His truck, with its rusted bumper and ladder rack, looked like a work boot in a room full of dress shoes. Arthur turned off the ignition. The engine ticked as it cooled. He sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. He wasn't afraid of death. He was afraid of the mess. Death was clean, dying was messy. He got out, locking the truck manually. Inside, the hospital smelled of floor wax and rubbing alcohol. The air was dry and recycled. Arthur walked to the reception desk. A young woman with purple braids didn't look up from her screen immediately. "I'm here for Robert Vance, ICU," Arthur said. She typed, her nails clicking rapidly. "ID, please." Arthur slid his driver's license across the counter. She glanced at it, then printed a sticker that said, "Visitor A. Vance." She slapped it onto his jacket without asking. "4th floor? Elevators on the left. Pick up the wall phone outside the double doors." The elevator ride was silent. Arthur watched the numbers climb. 2, 3, 4. The ICU waiting room was empty, except for a young couple sleeping awkwardly on 2 chairs pushed together in the corner. Arthur picked up the wall phone. "This is Arthur Vance." The doors buzzed open. Nurse Miller was older than she sounded on the phone. She had efficient movements and wore orthotic sneakers. She didn't smile. Arthur appreciated that. "Mr. Vance," she said, leading him down a corridor lined with glass rooms. "He's stable, but critical. The stroke caused a massive hemorrhage. We have him sedated to keep the intracranial pressure down. The neurologist will be doing rounds at 7, but—" She trailed off. She didn't need to finish the sentence. "Is he conscious?" Arthur asked. "No, and it's unlikely he will be again." They stopped at room 404. Arthur stepped inside. The machinery was loud. The rhythmic whoosh-click of the ventilator, the steady beeping of the cardiac monitor. In the center of the bed, amidst the tangle of tubes and wires, lay a stranger. The man in the bed was skeletal. His hair was thin and white, not the thick, dark mane Arthur remembered. His skin was the color of parchment. But it was the hands that got Arthur. They were resting on the sterile blue blanket. They were Vance's hands, broad palms, short fingers. Arthur looked at his own hands, then back at Robert's. Arthur pulled the metal visitor chair to the bedside. He didn't take his brother's hand. He just sat there, hands on his knees. "You look like hell, Rob," Arthur whispered. The ventilator hissed in response. Nurse Miller came in quietly, holding a clear plastic bag labeled "Patient Belongings." "This is everything he had on him," she said, placing it on the bedside table. "We need you to sign for it." Arthur signed the clipboard without reading it. When she left, he picked up the bag. It was light, pitifully light, for 60 years of life. He opened it. A wallet. Cheap leather cracking at the fold. A pack of cigarettes crushed. A lighter, a set of keys. A folded piece of paper. Arthur took out the paper first. It was a receipt from a diner in Kentucky, dated 3 weeks ago. On the back, in shaky handwriting, was Arthur's name and phone number. Underneath it, written in red ink, was a single word: promise. Arthur frowned. Promise? Robert never kept a promise in his life. He opened the wallet. No cash. A Social Security card. An expired driver's license from Tennessee, and a photo tucked into the clear plastic sleeve where a wife or girlfriend should be. Arthur pulled the photo out. He expected to see a picture of Michael, Robert's son, maybe from years ago. It wasn't Michael. It was a Polaroid. A boy, maybe 10 years old, sitting on the hood of a car, a beat-up station wagon. The boy had messy hair and was squinting into the sun. He wasn't smiling. He looked guarded, tough. Arthur flipped the photo over. Leo, 2024. Arthur stared at the date. Last year. "Who the hell is Leo?" Arthur muttered. He looked at the keys again. There were 3 keys. One for a GM car ignition, one standard house key, and a small brass key, the kind used for a padlock or a diary. Arthur felt a headache forming behind his eyes. He stood up and walked to the window. The sun was up now, casting long shadows across the hospital parking lot. He needed to call Michael. If Robert had another kid or a grandson, Michael would know. He pulled out his cell phone and scrolled through his contacts. He didn't have Michael's number. He hadn't spoken to his nephew since the funeral of Arthur's mother. He went back to the nurse's station. Miller was typing. "You said you didn't have a record of a son," Arthur said. "But he has a son. Michael Vance. He'd be about 40 now." Miller stopped typing. She looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Vance, I didn't want to bring this up until the doctor arrived, but we found a contact for Michael Vance in the hospital system from a previous admission years ago. We called him right after we called you." "And?" He said. Miller hesitated, choosing her words carefully. He said, "My father died 10 years ago, as far as I'm concerned. Do not call this number again," and he hung up. Arthur let out a short, dry laugh. "Sounds about right." "Mr. Vance," Miller leaned forward, "there is something else. The police officer who brought your brother in, he's in the waiting room. He asked to speak with family as soon as someone arrived. Arthur felt a cold prickle at the base of his neck. Police? Why? Was he in an accident? You should speak to Officer Henderson. Arthur walked back to the waiting room. A uniformed officer was standing by the vending machine, holding a cup of coffee. He looked young, clean-shaven, tight crew-cut. Officer? Arthur said. The cop turned. You, Arthur Vance? I am. Officer Henderson, Columbus PD. I was the one who answered the call at the motel. Henderson didn't offer a handshake. He looked tired. I'm sorry about your brother. He's not dead yet, Arthur said bluntly. What happened? Motel manager called it in. Said the guest in 104 hadn't checked out. We found him on the floor. Stroke, looks like. Henderson took a sip of coffee. But that's not why I'm here. I figured, Arthur said. He had nothing on him. No drugs, right? No drugs. He was clean. But he wasn't alone in the room, Mr. Vance. Arthur's hand tightened on the plastic bag of belongings in his pocket. He thought of the Polaroid. Who was with him? A kid, Henderson said. Boy. About 10 years old. He was sitting on the other bed watching TV. Hadn't moved in hours. Didn't say a word when we came in. Just pointed at your brother. Arthur felt the floor tilt slightly. Where's the boy now? Child Protective Services took emergency custody last night. He's at the temporary shelter downtown. Henderson pulled a small notebook from his pocket. Here's the thing. The kid had a backpack. No clothes, really. Just some comic books and a lockbox. Arthur touched the small brass key in his pocket. The kid won't talk, Henderson continued. Not a word. We don't know who he is. We ran his prints. Nothing. Your brother didn't have papers for him. But the kid, he wouldn't let go of your brother's hand until the paramedics forced him to. Henderson looked Arthur in the eye. Social Services is going to put him in the system by noon if we can't identify next of kin. Does the name Leo mean anything to you? Arthur looked at the cop. He looked back down the hall toward the ICU, where his brother lay dying, leaving behind one final complicated mess. Yeah, Arthur said, his voice raspy. It means something. The social worker is on her way here, Henderson said. She wants to know if you're willing to take custody pending the investigation, since you're the uncle. Arthur stared at him. I'm not the uncle. I don't know that kid. I haven't seen my brother in 30 years. Well, Henderson said, tossing his empty cup into the trash can. You're the only one who answered the phone. And right now, you're the only thing standing between that boy and a foster group home. Arthur turned away. He walked to the window looking out at the parking lot. He could see his truck. He could just get in it. He could sign the papers for Robert, authorize the palliative care, and drive back to his quiet, empty house. He could fix the gutter. He could pretend the phone never rang. He reached into his pocket and squeezed the brass key. The metal dug into his palm, sharp and real. The social worker, a woman named Mrs. Gable, who smelled like vanilla car air freshener and exhaustion, arrived 20 minutes later. She carried a clipboard, like a shield. Mr. Vance, she said, finding Arthur still standing by the window. I understand this is a shock, but I need to know if you are prepared to take temporary guardianship of Leo Vance. If not, I have a foster placement available in Chillicothe, but we need to leave within the hour. Arthur looked at the woman, then down at the brass key in his palm. It was warm now, heated by his own blood. I need to see him, Arthur said, before I sign anything. He's downstairs in the cafeteria with an officer. He refuses to eat. Arthur walked past her. He didn't wait for the elevator. He took the stairs, his heavy boots echoing in the concrete stairwell. Descent was easier than the climb, but the landing felt harder. In the cafeteria, sitting at a corner table, was the boy from the Polaroid, Leo. He was wearing a faded grey hoodie 2 sizes too big. He looked small, scrawny, with dark circles under eyes that were constantly darting around the room, assessing threats. He looked exactly like Robert did at 10 years old, before the alcohol bloated his face. On the table in front of him was a metal lockbox. His hand rested on top of it, fingers spread wide. Arthur approached the table. The police officer stood up, but Arthur waved him off. He pulled out the plastic chair opposite the boy and sat down. Leo didn't blink. He stared at Arthur's chin, then his hands. Arthur didn't say hello. He didn't ask, "How are you?" or offer condolences. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass key. He placed it on the table and slid it across the laminate surface. It stopped inches from the boy's hand. Leo looked at the key. Then he looked at Arthur. For the first time, the boy's guard dropped, just a fraction. He grabbed the key, inserted it into the lockbox and twisted. The click was sharp and loud in the quiet cafeteria. Leo lifted the lid. He pulled out a single, thick envelope and pushed it toward Arthur. Arthur took it. The handwriting on the front was shaky, the ink bleeding slightly into the paper. To Arthur. For when the time comes. Arthur tore it open. Inside wasn't a letter. It was a title deed to a 1998 Ford Ranger, signed over to Leo, but never filed. And wrapped in a sheet of notebook paper was a photo. It was a picture of Arthur. He was standing in front of his hardware store, sweeping the sidewalk. It had been taken from across the street, likely from a parked car. Arthur looked younger, stronger. On the notebook paper, Robert had written, "I told him you were the one who fixed things. I told him you were the strong one. I couldn't be that for him. I'm sorry I didn't call. I was ashamed. He's a good kid, Artie. He knows how to work. Don't let him turn into me." Arthur felt a tightness in his throat, a physical pressure like a vice. He swallowed it down. He looked at the boy. Leo was watching him, waiting for the verdict. Waiting to be rejected just like the world had rejected his father. Arthur folded the paper and put it in his pocket. He looked at the deed to the ranger. Useless. But the intent was there. "You hungry?" Arthur asked. Leo shook his head. "Doesn't matter," Arthur said. "You need to eat." Arthur stood up and looked at Mrs. Gable, who was hovering nearby. "Where are the papers?" "Mr. Vance, are you sure? This is a significant—" "Give me the damn papers," Arthur said, his voice level but hard as iron. He signed them on the cafeteria table, pressing down so hard the pen almost tore the page. He didn't read the fine print. He knew what he was signing. He was signing away his quiet life. He was signing away his clean house and his silence. Thank you for listening this far. If this story resonates with you and you believe in stepping up when family calls, please hit the like button. It helps us share these moments with more people. Half an hour later, Arthur walked back into the ICU room alone. The monitor was still beeping. Robert was still there, but he was fading. The nurse said it would be minutes now. They had removed the ventilator per Arthur's authorization. Arthur stood by the bed. He reached out and placed his hand on Robert's shoulder. It was bone and skin. "I got him, Rob," Arthur said to the silence. "I got him. You can go now." The line on the monitor went flat 10 minutes later. Arthur didn't cry. He watched the line until the nurse turned the machine off. He nodded once to the doctor, signed the death certificate and walked out. He went down to the lobby. Leo was sitting on a bench, his backpack between his legs, the lockbox on his lap. "Let's go," Arthur said. They walked out to the parking lot. The sun was fully up now, harsh and bright. Arthur unlocked the passenger side of the Ram. Leo climbed in without a word. He struggled with the heavy door, but Arthur didn't reach over to help him. He let the boy pull it shut himself. Thud. The drive back was silent. 3 hours of highway. Leo fell asleep against the window, his breath fogging up the glass. Arthur drove with 2 hands on the wheel, checking the mirrors every 10 seconds. He thought about his house. The empty bedroom that used to be his mother's sewing room. It was full of boxes now. He would have to clear them out. They pulled into the driveway just as the sun was starting to dip. The house looked the same, but it felt different. Heavier. Arthur killed the engine. Leo woke up looking around, disoriented. "We're here," Arthur said. They got out. Arthur unlocked the front door and held it open. Leo hesitated on the porch, looking at the threshold like it was a trap. "Boots off by the door," Arthur said, moving inside. "Coat on the rack." Leo stepped inside. He took off his sneakers and placed them neatly next to Arthur's work boots. Arthur walked to the kitchen. He opened the fridge. He took out the block of cheddar, the pickles, and a loaf of bread from the pantry. He set them on the table. "I don't cook on Tuesdays," Arthur said. "Make a sandwich." Leo stood there, unsure. Arthur pulled a knife from the block and set it down handle first toward the boy. "Go on." Leo moved to the table. He picked up the knife. He cut 2 thick slices of cheese. He made 2 sandwiches. He put one on a plate and pushed it toward Arthur. Arthur looked at the plate. Then he looked at the boy. "Tomorrow," Arthur said, taking a bite of the sandwich, "we're going to fix the gutter on the east side. It rattles when the wind blows. I need someone to hold the ladder." Leo nodded. He took a bite of his sandwich. Arthur chewed slowly. The house was quiet, but it wasn't empty anymore. The silence wasn't heavy, it was just quiet. Arthur looked out the window. The sun was gone. The gutter rattled once in the wind. "We'll fix it," Arthur said. Leo looked up. "Yes, sir." Arthur took another bite. It was a start. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end of this powerful story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to keep sharing moments like this with our community. If you want to keep feeling these stories, start a marathon with our most loved narratives. Some videos are appearing on your screen right now. Click on one of them and continue this journey with us. A warm hug, and may God bless your home and your family. See you in the next video.